So, got some new content for you guys today, and I wanted to play this video, which is about so before I hit play. So, Russia in the 90s is actually a very important historical period where a coalition of libertarians and nationalists won against a far-left bureaucratic regime in the 80s. They didn't win exactly how they thought they were going to win. And what happened was very varied outcomes in the former Soviet Union, where the Baltics did very well, Eastern Europe a little bit less so, but they kind of clambered out of it. And Russia itself was like Grand Theft Auto. Okay, so I'm going to show you just some things because it's useful to understand how things can go sideways historically. Even though, from today's standpoint, many Russians would still say it's still worth it to shut down the Soviet Union and get rid of the gulags and so on and so forth. But it was much, 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 much messier to retire that system, to retire communism, because communism wasn't built to be shut down. Similarly, retiring Keynesianism may turn out to actually be extremely messy. Okay, so with that, let me show you this video, and then we'll go through a bunch of questions and stuff. If you don't know what period history, you should.
Play through my laptop.
The 90s in Russia.
You guys hear that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Is it possible to turn on the subtitle?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Of utmost importance, this topic holds in understanding modern Russia. Not only did it leave a huge imprint on the rest of the world, it changed us, Russians. So let's talk about the 90s in Russia. For most people in the West, the 1990s were an era of relative peace. Great music, great movies, great books and TV shows, great economy even. Cell phones, computers, and connectivity everywhere. And the Cold War was over. A perfect bonus. A tide of progress and everything good about it is just about to sweep the whole world. Except, this is so far from how ordinary Russians remember the 90s. The 90s to us Russians were an end of the line as we knew it. The Soviet Union fell apart. The socialist system was gone, and adapting to the world of capitalism and free market was especially hard for the rigid Soviet-found economy. It was a period of tectonic change where people had lost their accustomed lifestyles. And it's not just poverty and food shortfalls we're talking about. Teachers became salesmen, salesmen became businessmen, and almost everyone knew at least one real gangster. Some benefited from the 90s, becoming rich and successful, but even for them, the 90s were a time of change that they weren't really ready for. This is why the 90s are still often called Likhi 90s. This word itself is impossible to translate, but most Western scholars prefer the term the wild 90s, like the Wild West. And indeed, just like the Wild West in American popular culture, a mythical and dangerous no man's land where you could become rich or dead in a week. That's what the 90s were like for for us. Yep, the 90s for Russians were similar. Russians struggled to adapt to this new life, to provide for themselves and their loved ones in this new land of both lawlessness but opportunity as well, and later poured their feelings and fantasy into creating the remnants of it. Take a look at one of the most famous movies about the 90s in Russia, Brother by Alexei Balaji. Shot in 1997, it was a major box office hit, which was not easy to do back then. No one wanted to watch Russian movies anymore, and cinemas survived solely by renting out space to shops. But despite that, pirate copies of the film sold in hundreds of thousands across Russia. The movie itself tells the story of a 22-year-old demobilized conscript, Danila, who just returned after serving in the Chechen War, looking for his brother, a place to stay, and a job. The Chechen Wars, actually there were two of them back in the 90s, were also a huge testament of the time. Numerous recruits drafted, sent to the front line, and then left on their own to deal with the aftermaths of both PTSD and a crumbling economy. It jump-started a massive wave of alcohol and drug addiction, a curse for jobless young men who only knew how to fight. This is where we find Danila, who tries to start a new life after war on the backdrops of a grim and empty St. Petersburg. This is where he meets his brother and becomes his wingman hitman, killing other gangsters in the city. So he's a murderer, but Russians look up to him. You see, Danila Bablov was the face of the 90s. He was no Rambo or Commando, who were very popular back then. Danila, he was a quiet boy who became this silent, gloomy man during a war that he didn't want, and then came back from not knowing what else he could do with his life in a country that now valued violence above all. Russians themselves, when asked on Reddit about their life in the 90s, copy the same image of Russia. They think about people trying to sell anything just to get by, gangs and mafia offering law enforcement and protection instead of the state, food and medicine shortages, long lines in shops, drug and alcohol addiction en masse. True, one could make money and become someone like a Monogram mortgage, for example, but also one could lose all their savings overnight because the ruble devalued. Here's some fun math for you. A kilogram of cheese cost 415 rubles in 1992 and just over 27,000 rubles in 1997. In 92, you could buy a winter coat for about 16,000 rubles, and in 97, a similar coat would cost you $1.5 million. A funeral casket was worth around 2,000 rubles in 92, and 5 years later, it spiked to 336,000 rubles. A fun exercise in math indeed, just to illustrate how deeply damaged the economy was. But what's more difficult to assess is the extent to which the nation's psychological health was destroyed by endless tragedies, families broken apart because of substance addiction, years of living in this permanent state of stress. Math is impossible to measure. Every modern Russian is scarred in their own way by the 90s. So for children of the 90s, they might remember their drinking parents and living through food insecurity, for example. And then teenagers of the 90s could recall struggling with street gangs, either being members or being abused by members of street gangs. Adults of the 90s had to work multiple jobs just to provide a bare minimum for their families, while businessmen of the 90s had to live in fear for their life and their families' lives, constantly looking over their shoulder, and yes, many were murdered. But hey, it wasn't all that bad. I mean, bubblegum, MTV, and Western culture flooding in with a promise of a brighter future with advertisements on plastic bags. All the while, kids were actually solving these kind of math problems. As a result of the default, which turned into the economic crisis in 1998, the price of imported goods rose by 5 times. Before the default, a pair of sneakers cost 200 rubles. But how many percent is the new price higher than the old one? By how many percent is the old price lower than the new one? Now, finish this sentence. As a result of the default, prices rose on average by percent. Perfection. By the way, the second half of the 90s is actually considered livable compared to the first one. If you were a kid back then, you'd remember getting to know this sort of entirely new form of entertainment, MTV and everything that Western capitalism had up its sleeve for an emerging economy. Neon-colored leggings, Love is Bubblegum, video cassettes and slinkies. The 90s also gave birth to what we call or the lavish noughties, an era that was almost bent on compensating for the poverty of the 90s. Cities got safer, bigger, richer. So did the Russians themselves. Because after all, for every dark night, there is a brighter day. If you ask me, I remember the 90s as being super bleak. I was a kid and, for example, I never used the underpass in fear of getting raped there. That's what girls in Moscow did. I saw 2 dead bodies of women in central Moscow at separate events on my way to school, and I remember used syringes everywhere. On staircases of residential buildings, in my school, on playgrounds. It was really very dark, and for me, there is nothing romantic about the 90s at all.
All right.
Let me show you, let's show one more clip.
Okay.
George, so let me show you how it was on the American side at that time. Let's go back. Cold War, so George Bush, December 25th, 1991. Yes. Okay, let's go this way. So this is on the other side.
Good evening, and Merry Christmas to all Americans across our great country.
It's not like that.
During these last few months, you and good evening, and Merry Christmas to all Americans across our great country. During these last few months, you and I have witnessed one of the greatest dramas of the 20th century, the historic and revolutionary transformation of a totalitarian dictatorship, the Soviet Union, and the liberation of its peoples. As we celebrate Christmas, this day of peace and hope, I thought we should take just a few minutes to reflect on what these events mean for us as Americans. For over 40 years, the United States led the West in the struggle against communism and the threat it posed to our most precious values. This struggle shaped the lives of all Americans. It forced all nations to live under the specter of nuclear destruction. That confrontation is now over. The nuclear threat, while far from gone, is receding. Eastern Europe is free. The Soviet Union itself is no more. This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values. Every American can take pride in this victory, from the millions of men and women who served our country in uniform to millions of Americans who supported their country in a strong defense under 9 presidents. New, independent nations have emerged out of the wreckage of the Soviet Empire. Last weekend, these former republics formed a Commonwealth of Independent States. This act marks the end of the old Soviet Union, signified today by Mikhail Gorbachev's decision to resign as president. I'd like to express on behalf of the American people my gratitude to Mikhail Gorbachev for years of sustained commitment to world peace and for his intellect, vision, and courage. I spoke with Mikhail Gorbachev this morning. We reviewed the many accomplishments of the past few years and spoke of hope for the future. Mikhail Gorbachev's revolutionary policies transformed the Soviet Union. His policies permitted the peoples of Russia and the other republics to cast aside decades of oppression and establish the foundations of freedom. His legacy guarantees him an honored place in history and provides a solid basis for the United States to work in equally constructive ways with his successors. The United States applauds and supports the historic choice for freedom by the new states of the Commonwealth. We congratulate them on the peaceful and democratic path they have chosen and for their careful attention to nuclear control and safety during this transition. Despite a potential for instability and chaos, these events clearly serve our national interest. We stand tonight before a new world of hope and possibilities for our children, a world we could not have contemplated a few years ago. The challenge for us now is to engage these new states in sustaining the peace and building a more prosperous future. And so today, based on commitments and assurances given to us by some of these states concerning nuclear safety, democracy, and free markets, I am announcing some important steps designed to begin this process. First, the United States recognizes and welcomes the emergence of a free, independent, and democratic Russia led by its courageous president, Boris Yeltsin. Our embassy in Moscow will remain there as our embassy to Russia. We will support Russia's assumption of the USSR's seat as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. I look forward to working closely with President Yeltsin in support of his efforts to bring democratic and market reform to Russia. Second, the United States also recognizes the independence of Ukraine, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Kyrgyzstan, all states that have made specific commitments to us. We will move quickly to establish diplomatic relations with these states and build new ties to them. We will sponsor membership in the United Nations for those not already members. Third, the United States also recognizes today, as independent states, the remaining 6 former Soviet republics: Moldova, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, Georgia, and Uzbekistan. We will establish diplomatic relations with them when we are satisfied that they have made commitments to responsible security policies and democratic principles, as have the other states we recognize today. These dramatic events come at a time when Americans are also facing challenges here at home. I know that for many of you, these are difficult times, and I want all Americans to know that I'm committed to attacking our economic problems at home with the same determination we brought to winning the Cold War. I'm confident we will meet this challenge, as we have so many times before. But we cannot if we retreat into isolationism. We will only succeed in this interconnected world by continuing to lead the fight for free people and free and fair trade. A free and prosperous global economy is essential for America's prosperity. That means jobs and economic growth right here at home. This is a day of great hope for all Americans. Our enemies have become our partners, committed to building democratic and civil societies. They ask for our support, and we will give it to them. We will do it because as Americans, we can do no less. For our children, we must offer them the guarantee of a peaceful and prosperous future, a future grounded in a world built on strong democratic principles, free from the specter of global conflict. May God bless the people of the new nations in the Commonwealth of Independent States. And on this special day of peace on earth, goodwill toward men, may God continue to bless the United States of America. Good night.
I'll show you one more clip. Gorbachev, he's not. All right, so this was very helpful is to kind of triangulate, right? What was important about, before we play this, we'll play this in a second. Notice that in that clip from 1981, what did George Bush say? He's like, yeah, there's potential for instability and chaos. He did acknowledge that. But we're just going to kind of supervise it, this external supervisor sort of supervise it and make sure there weren't any nuclear bombs going off. And moreover, the recognition by the external superpower is what led to the creation of all these new nations. Like, that diplomatic recognition kicked off a bunch of other things where all these other countries recognized Ukraine as a real country and Kyrgyzstan and so on and so forth, right? So now this is kind of comical, but Gorbachev, who he was praising right then for taking down the Soviet Union, a few years later, here's what Gorbachev said.
Это Горбачев. Почему? Это из-за него у нас в экономике бардак.
Благодаря ему у нас новые возможности.
Это из-за него у нас политическая нестабильность.
А благодаря ему у нас свобода.
Полный хаос.
Перспективы.
Политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас есть исход.
За Горбачева!
Saying that.
So that, yeah. So I'm not, have you guys
Seen that? Have you guys seen that clip before? No. Yeah. Okay. All right, good.
No.
So those three videos give you start to triangulate on what a period of time is like when you don't just see one perspective, right? Even a few sources give you a sense of it. And put this on screen. The reason I think this particular era, there's a few eras I want to go through. The reason I think that era is very important is there's lessons for the present day. So if you go to NS Learn, there's 3 new tutorials there I want to go through, right? So this is what we were just talking about, Russia in the 90s, right? What did the transition from communism look like in practice? It wasn't that smooth. Some countries it was relatively smooth, like Estonia, the smaller countries, the ones which felt like Russia was to blame and that they had been oppressed and now they could sort of stick the Russians with the blame for the whole situation. They felt, okay, we have freedom, but we're on our way. The Russians themselves, though, that overturned the Soviet Union were kind of a confused mix of a bunch of different people that were against communism. But what were they for? There were 4 different things. Some people wanted to revive the Orthodox Church. Some people wanted to be capitalist, right? Some people just wanted to end the war in Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. There are many different reasons that this coalition of people overturned the Soviet Union, and many were like moderate communists, as funny as that sounds, right? Where they didn't think that the whole thing was going to collapse. They basically thought, oh, we can probably fix it. Their mental model in the 80s wasn't, this whole thing is just going to be totally over and broken into a million pieces in like 5 years, right? So there's this term that lady was using, the wild 90s, right? It's the closest thing is like the Wild West, where this term over here, which I'll butcher in the Russian, likia devianosti, right? What that means is it's got kind of it's a romantic aspect almost in a sense of like a dashing or daring, turbulent, wild, crazy, right? Am I right about that? Roughly, right? Okay. But so there's like a sort of a bravado aspect, but it's also a chaos aspect and so on. So the closest thing is the Wild West, right? And the reason that she ended it by saying, the 90s sucked for her is that it probably on balance did suck for most people, but people remember the exceptional, the fortunes that were made, the freedom and so on that came out of that. That Pizza Hut commercial, as silly as it is, does kind of capture that, where the older guys were mad and the younger guys were like, well, we have opportunity and we're not getting crushed by the Soviet Union anymore. Even if there's chaos, I prefer that to being, just monotony, right? So it's a very, very kind of thing. But one of the biggest things is that people thought that they could take down the Soviet Empire and the justifying ideology while sort of somehow keeping the territory, okay? And you know, the people who did manage that were actually in China, because China sort of did, because they had continuous reform, didn't have like discrete overnight, didn't have like a public fight over the political system. It was always supposedly communist all the way through, right? So the same territory that Mao acquired under the banner of communism is really now still there under the banner of effectively Chinese nationalism. Even if it's not, you know, they didn't actually change the name from the Chinese Communist Party. Like what Xi talks about is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It's basically MAGA, but for China, right? Like that's actually the legit, you know, you haven't seen that? Great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, right? So his call for the great revival or rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, 5,000-year history, achieving rejuvenation is the dream of the Chinese people. It sounds great in Chinese. And this is a traditionalist, nationalist kind of approach that is completely different from Mao's concept of the Four Olds, right? The Four Olds, everything that Mao was about was destroying the old world, right? Everything that Xi is about is rejuvenating China. Okay, so that's a complete inversion from cultural far left of like basically destroying everything of the past to essentially nationalist right? It's a complete 180-degree inversion. However, while the culture totally flipped 180 degrees, the territory remains the same, the party remains the same. So they have the same party state, but they turned it not 180 degrees at once, but by degrees over time, if that makes sense, right? And there's a saying in China that Russia exists to show China what not to do. Okay, so I'm not sure if I can translate that. So there's anyway, that's a thing on Chinese social media. Russia exists to show China what not to do. For example, like Russia goes and invades Ukraine and blows up Ukraine, and China's like, okay, we're not going to get baited into doing that in Taiwan, right? Or Russia goes and does this crazy political reform, and it's all democracy and common, you know, and they throw out the past, and China says, okay, we don't want to do exactly that, right? So the point is that Russia in the 90s it was a weird situation where the conservatives, the libertarians, the nationalists, the religious people, and so on, the Christians, they won, and then they lost, and then they won again, because, you know, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church, for example, there's this thing that was dynamited there, okay, so the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, right? Basically, Stalin blew this beautiful church up, and he converted it into a swimming pool called Moskva Pool, right? And the point was sort of to have people go and piss in the pool to like defile the church or whatever, basically. That was like the whole point, like, you know, God is dead, the state is here, and so on and so forth. And what the Russians did after the, you know, fall of communism is they literally rebuilt this, you know, incredible cathedral from photos, right? So that's not something that you could do under communism. So sort of the rebirth, like the end of the USSR was the rebirth of, you know, nationalist, traditionalist, Orthodox Russia, right? So this is not, it's a weird kind of thing where they, and I'm sure there's the Russians who will speak of this, but there's a superposition of emotions where on the one hand, they're happy that they have or many people are happy that they have the Orthodox, you know, Christian, traditional Russia back, but they also sort of liked being really strong under Stalin, but they also knew that Stalin threw them in a gulag, but they were also mad at the West for kind of screwing them in the 90s, but they also liked the new kind of capitalist world better than the communist world. It's a complex mix of contradictory emotions where there was a win, and then there's a loss, and then there's a win. It was simply not a straightforward win, okay? Now, if you notice also, what does she say at the end? She's like, oh, there are surges all over and so on and so forth. Again, does this kind of echo and remind you of like, you know, certain, you know, like this is similar to where the US is now in some of this, right? So anyway, as you go through these questions, right, there's such insane craziness that happened in Russia in the 90s. For example, in 1993, Boris Yeltsin had tanks shell the Russian White House, okay? There was a constitutional crisis, and it was just like Grand Theft Auto, right? There's something called shock therapy. This is like an overnight capitalist reform. There's this movie called Brat, which was mentioned there, that you can watch. This is one of those things that is said, like sometimes your first piece of information on a time period Obviously, this is a dramatic version, and not everybody's running around shooting like 17 people or what have you, right? So it's a, you know, I was going to say a Hollywood version, but it's a movie version. Still, this is a good movie. This and Brat 2 are something which captured that era. And the reason it's so important to see this is, if you're in the West, the 1990s are thought of as like, I mean, incredibly fun time, right? Like that's, you know, the things that she was mentioning, it was, when the 90s in America, for those, you know, I'm a little bit older than you guys, but when I grew up in the 90s, it was something where there was music and movies and sports, and nobody cared about, like, to care about politics was like caring about a bus schedule, or like, you know, you'd be like caring about the tax code or the post office. Like, nobody cared about politics. Nobody paid any attention to that, right? And it was the most boring thing in the world. It truly didn't matter, and it wasn't cool. And why would you care? It was like really being interested in paperwork or accounting or something like that, right? Sorry, I know.
It was a great time for that.
No offense to our accountants in the audience, right?
90s rock.
Yes, but the 90s in Russia were Grand Theft Auto, right? And you know, there's that Grand Theft Auto itself. I don't know if you guys know, has one of the Grand Theft Autos has Niko Bellic from the former Soviet Union. He's like, you know, I rob people, kill people. You know, that's how the thing opens up, right? And of course, many Eastern Europeans are totally great people. It was just that was the situation that derives gangsterism, right? So, you know, crazy things happened to the Soviet Union. Like the pensions that they had just went to zero. Part of the whole Milosevic thing with Serbia was he was promising people they're going to get their pensions back. Okay. Now, by the way, do you guys have any? I didn't actually know this number until recently. Do you know how many people are on Social Security in the U.S.? This is a crazy number. Wow, 72.5 million people. That's like a quarter of the country. That's like 1 in 5 people are on Social Security, okay? That's just one of these programs. And when you look at, you know, the numbers here, the ratio of workers to beneficiaries, or like these numbers are just up and to the right in terms of the pension benefits, right? And, you know, Pete Peterson and others, they have this foundation where they can show you every insane number on this. I'll just show you a few. This is the graph of what Social Security looks like over time, you know, in terms of benefits, just an exponential, just going whoosh like this. Here's what it looks like over the last few years, right? So, what's the answer to something that's going up to the right like that? It's just going to go to zero. That's what actually did happen, right? That is not what anybody's planning for. That's not what anybody's thinking about. Exactly how it goes to zero, it'll be one of the messiest things in world history. People are going to get really, 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 really insanely mad about that, and I understand. And by the way, that's just one. The reason it's important to like see this is that was a giant global superpower that had nuclear weapons and had military bases everywhere, and it thought of itself as really invincible and so on and so forth. And then when they actually fixed communism, they sort of also broke the magic, right? In a sense that there was a sort of legitimating magic for the empire. And then, you know, when they didn't believe in that, this is actually there's a really, really important article here by a guy who lived through this in the USSR. It's called Reality Crash, okay? This came out in March 2022. And essentially what he said was, this is a Russian immigrant, right? Anton grew up in what was the Soviet Union just after a small introduction of freedom blew the autocratic system to pieces. With a free press, every government lied for 7 years with the papers, but paradoxically what followed was not a world in which people believed nothing. For a brief moment, people believed everything. So this is like a special on like Soviet television where there's a show called Lenin Was a Mushroom, okay? So people believed in 1991, it was explained in precise detail that Lenin was in fact a mushroom, right? Go ahead, it's crazy, right? So, not just a mushroom, but also a radio wave, right? He had not always been a mushroom, but had become one through the constant consumption, which had become, et cetera, right? And the documentary simply overlooked it. It was intended to be a humorous hoax, but a lot of people didn't understand whether, this sounds familiar in terms of like misinformation, disinformation, breakdown of trust, right, et cetera. All of these, like when you had this total lock on the central narrative and then it just broke open, all these new narratives flooded in, And then people believed in anything, they believed in nothing, and so on and so forth. That's what actually Glasnost and Perestroika were, free speech and free markets were destabilizing to that lockdown society, right? And, you know, see, state control of media was not incidental to Soviet power, it was essential both ideologically and pragmatically. The mass literacy, you know, all the stuff which often they'll defend communism in it, oh, we made everybody read. The reason they did that is they could install a port in your head to install Soviet propaganda. That was the point. If you couldn't read, you couldn't understand crazy communist propaganda, right? So the point of literacy was like an install base. And they had something called Pravda, which was actually the Communist Party paper, the paper of record. It was beyond prestigious, it was fundamental. Now, you know, there's something else in the West that calls itself, you know what Pravda translates as? It translates as truth, okay? There's another institution that calls itself the paper of record that claims itself to be the truth. Gigantic billboards saying the truth is more important than ever. You know, here is the New York Times truth, right? Literally, if you go to Google Translate and you ask, you know, truth in Russian, it's Pravda, right? So, Pravda right there. So, the New York Times calls itself the paper of record and the truth. Exactly, as not even, you know, not even trying to edit on this, that's exactly what the Soviet paper was, right? And it was the organizing point and so on and so forth. Now the New York Times just doesn't matter. It's just gotten completely crushed by X and others. This was not obvious like 4 years ago, but like it's obvious now. They denounce people there. It doesn't even make a ripple. You know, they're basically a blog now. They're Sulzberger's blog, right? And they're no longer the authoritative source of consensus reality. It's X, right? That the flippening is here. You can look at it in views. You can look at it in lots of other things. Okay, and so the reason it's important to like look at this is like a relatively recent episode that actually a lot of people you might know lived through, right? I'm not saying every single piece of history repeats in exactly the same way, but there's similar initial conditions. Keynesianism is not exactly the same as communism, but it's similar, right? What is Keynesianism? It is essentially the money printing in the West. So communism, they went house to house with guns and they would, you know, kick in the door and seize the farm and, you know, rape the wife and kill the husband and take the son to a gulag. That's what communism was, right? But Keynesianism is communism but for wimps, okay? They print the money, and when they print the money, everybody is diluted down, and it's like silent seizure of huge hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars of wealth, right? So you don't have to go house to house with a gun, you don't even have to arouse any resistance. In fact, it doesn't even look like you're robbing anything. You can say you're the lender of last resort, you can say all of these kinds of things the Fed uses, but fundamentally what you're doing is you're just diluting down everybody, right? Like basically you're counterfeiting giant quantities of money, and everybody's invisibly robbed. Rather than taking the money out of their hands, you just dilute it down 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 70, 80, 90, 100%, right? Which is what has happened to the dollar over time. So the transition from a Keynesian system will actually have, will include some issues. So anyway, so basically this set of questions will just kind of give you context on what the 90s Russia was like. And also from that, you understand why modern Russia is what it is. They went through this period of total chaos, right? And who got them out? Well, it was, the way they think about it, was Putin, that's, you know, young Putin, 1999, essentially was the strongman that basically came to power and, you know, essentially brought in, people will say, in Russia, they'll say, you look at GDP over time, like it was terrible, and then when Putin took over, it finally started its rise like this, right? Up till about 2014, okay? Now, after 2014, basically, you know, after Crimea, Russia's been in a war with the West, and so on and so forth, so it's basically been flat for a decade, and so on and so forth. But a lot of Putin's legitimacy was this run-up, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's Russia in the 90s. Let me give you two other historical episodes to know about. The Weimar hyperinflation, right? So, you know, I am happy that Bitcoin's at all-time highs, right? It's great. It's got no blocks on it anymore, right? Everybody in all the governments, like all of the resistance, all the friction, you know, like with Gary Gensler attacking the whole space and so on and so forth, gone, right? We're getting strategic Bitcoin reserves, we have Argentina setting it up and so on and so forth. So we may see something, let me show you what happened to the price of gold historically, okay? When something, you know, just really, nothing moves faster than price when it really starts moving, okay? When it really starts moving, it is just a rebalancing of the world, and essentially that old thing is now, there's a software installed in people's heads and it's literally worth this piece of paper, right? So this is this insane graph of the price of gold in Weimar marks over the period of a few years, where it was like kind of normal inflation, and you know, notice this is a log scale, and it was definitely rising, but then it just went bananas over the span of a few years, okay? And this is, you know, a billion, and it was only at, you know, it was like normal inflation, like over here in a sense, and then just went bananas, loss of faith in the currency, and the new thing was there, right? And the Weimar hyperinflation is something, there's a great book called When Money Dies, right? And the thing about this, again, is it's more complicated than it seems, because people at the beginning of this didn't know what they were getting into. They just thought it was like normal inflation. Oh man, things are getting expensive, or what have you, right? And they didn't know, because you know, everything's obvious in foresight or hindsight. They didn't realize that this thing was going to get just completely out of control. Also, very important. So, at the beginning of Weimar, early on, everybody thought they were getting rich, because all these asset prices were going high. My banker congratulates me on every new rise, but he does not dispel the secret uneasiness which my growing wealth aroused in me. It already amounts to millions, right? So what was happening was the mark was getting devalued. So it gets devalued 50%. Your portfolio 2x's, and it seems like you're making money, and you are in nominal terms, but not in real terms. You actually have an external benchmark in terms of ounces of gold or something to see if you're actually making money, something that isn't printable, right? And so, you know, the value is rising to an extent which seems to be incomprehensible, and all this makes me uneasy, right? So how does like the S&P roaring and so on? Part of it is the devaluation of the dollar. Like basically, if you look at this, this is the official number, by the way. That dollar's lost 25% of its value since 2020, right? That's the official number. What's the actual number? I don't know. What is it going to be? Well, there's actually a few crazy things happening. First is Bitcoin's booming, of course. Number two is Fed rate cuts happened a few months ago. Number three, this whole trade war that's about to get going in a really big way. China is actually trying to get ahead of it, where China, they put a thing out there saying they need to boost domestic demand, to boost inflation within China, to boost prices globally so there's less negotiating room. Basically, if prices are already high, you can't impose tariffs on China because it'll cost too much to people. It removes your room, your cushion. You see what I'm saying, right? So China is actually seeking to boost inflation. At the same time, Bitcoin is mooning, and the Fed has cut rates, and so on and so forth. And all blockades on crypto are gone at the government level, and, right? So that's a setup for just something where all the forces that are blocking something just all go away at once, and it just goes boom, like that. We'll see what happens, but this is just something I want to put on the radar. So understanding the Weimar hyperinflation, you know, there are a lot of things that were interesting about this, and you can read this book, you can flip through it. But, you know, one of the key things were businesses that, you know, obtain hard foreign currency through exports. So the equivalent today would be like obtaining cryptocurrency, right? And continue to print money after it's clearly feeling hyperinflation. I mean, obviously, but it's also something that the government can't stop doing because it needs to satisfy its Social Security benefits and Medicare benefits, and so like it'll keep doing that until the stuff is worthless. So that's just like the only way politically it works, right? So those people who get to hard currency first, there's that saying, everybody gets Bitcoin at the price they deserve, or what have you, like, you know, because like that's just what the redenomination looks like, right? There's gold or digital gold or whatever, right? So Weimar is an important episode to understand. Now, to be clear, by the way, what's interesting is Germany was able to reboot after Weimar. Weimar was like zeroing out the scoreboard. Everybody's number over their heads, like how much money they'd saved, just all got zeroed out, other than those who had gold or what have you. It got zeroed out, but it got rebooted into something very nasty, right? People were really mad, right? And they blamed people who they thought had done it and what have you, and you guys know that story. So then the third thing to understand, which is a little bit more positive, is the Wild West, right? So when you did have this sort of anarchic frontier, right, and when regulations were gone, like the Wild West was as close to, this is a different Wild West, right? This is like, there's the Wild East of Russian land, this is the Wild West of America. So how was the American West actually won? How is it different from Hollywood movies? So there's this really famous article that's worth reading if you haven't read it, called, by friend, it's short, it's only like 10 pages, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, right? And essentially his point was that the closing of the American frontier, the official closing in 1890 when there wasn't any free land, that changed what America had been about. The whole point of America was anybody could come, get some land, make something of themselves, right? And there's a related book that came out around that time that I've also linked here, which is very worth reading, okay? It's very much worth reading. It's got a funny name, it's called Communistic Societies of the United States, right? But the thing about this book is, let me see if I get the PDF. At the time, communism didn't mean what we now think of as communism, which is a far left ideology. Communism meant, or communistic meant like co-living, okay? So it's kind of, sometimes words have a certain meaning and they take on a different meaning over time and people forget the original meaning, right? So in the 1800s, communes meant co-living, okay? And actually, these co-living experiments were opt-in societies. That's the biggest difference versus communism of the 20th century. Communism in the 20th century, they built prison states under the name of sharing, right? You were forced to share, okay? But communism in the 1800s was not like that. Communism in the 1800s was essentially opt-in experiments in co-living, and they all competed with each other, right? So this book is this phenomenally good book, right? Communistic Societies in the United States. And it's worth reading or at least skimming in conjunction with, here's the book, The Communistic Societies of the United States, right? This is the manual on like, it's like 480 pages on like a dozen startup societies in the US, right? So if you're interested in starting like new societies, you can see the ups and downs of these places, what worked for them, what didn't. And of course, you'll have to transplant those lessons into the modern day with modern technology, but there's certain aspects of human nature that are still constant, right? And it's like Harvard Business School case studies before doing a business, you know? I think it's valuable to look at that below society to at least have a few known patterns, like gravitational paths for planets, like configurations of humans that will move in a certain way. You can study the configurations of people in the past and look at their historical patterns and learn something from it. Anyway, the thing about this book, which is really interesting, is it opens up where he's actually saying that the frontier was actually really important because, let me see if I can, they use these long sentences, so let me see if I can explain it. Nor can anyone doubt the great importance both the security of the capitalist and the intelligence and happiness of the non-capitalist of increasing the number of avenues to independence for the latter. For the character and conduct of our own population, nothing so stimulates intelligence in the poor as a reasonable prospect that industry and economy may raise themselves out of the condition. Take away entirely the grounds of such a hope, and a great mass of poor people would gradually sink into stupidity and a blind discontent. In other words, the ability to raise their station in life is what was, if you work hard, you can make it, was a big part of it, right? And what he says here, which is really interesting, this was a big thing. Hitherto, in the United States, our cheap and fertile lands have acted as an important safety valve for the enterprise and discontent of our non-capitalist population. Every hired workman knows that if he chooses to use economy and industry in his calling, he may, without great or insurmountable difficulty, establish himself in independence on the public lands. And in fact, a large portion of our most energetic, intelligent mechanics do constantly seek these lands, where they master nature in adverse circumstances, and at the worst, leave their children, right? In other words, the ability of anybody who is discontented to go west, get a piece of land and level up and basically become, quote, a founder of their own farm, meant that people accepted their situation as a employee at a factory because they always knew they had that optionality of, okay, if you really think you can build your own factory, your own farm, go out west and get the land, right? So the existence of the frontier was really important, even if people didn't avail themselves of it. To know that they had that option meant that they knew that they were, in a sense, being lazy or entitled when they just asked for more money rather than going and founding something, right? And so what he says is, the eagerness of some of our wisest public men for the acquisition of new territory has arisen from their conviction that this opening was essential to the security of our futures of free and peaceful state. For though not 1 in 100, even 1 in 1,000 of our poor and so-called laboring class may choose to actually achieve independence, is the plain that knowledge that anyone may do so makes those who not more content with their lot, right? Which they feel to be of choice and not compulsion. In other words, even if only 1% or 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000 people goes and found something, the fact of you can be a founder essentially has people quiet down. They're not as mad because they could go and build something. And the eagerness of some of our wisest public men for the acquisition of territory. Why did the smarter U.S. presidents focus on opening the frontier? Why did they do the Louisiana Purchase? Why did they do all this stuff? Because that open, free land was a safety valve where they could manage the country, and anybody who was really ambitious and wanted power didn't have to contest for it politically. They could go to the frontier, right? This is part of why Elon wants Mars. This is part of why the reopening of the internet frontier in 1991 led to the rise of all these ambitious technologists outside of politics, okay? So this is why we're doing what we're doing. We're reopening the physical frontier using the internet. This is why cryptocurrency is important, right? The interesting thing, though, is there's a conflict between the old world and the new, because the digital frontier is only partially physical. It's only starting to become physical. And so you're only partially on the frontier. You're still under the jurisdiction of the old world, right? And then with Bitcoin and crypto, we've gotten partially out of that because we're out of their political jurisdiction, their economic jurisdiction, and then eventually we'll get out of their physical jurisdiction and actually be able to found new things. But this is it's going to be a messy process. So so I'll leave you to kind of read the references here, okay? But you know, when you read these articles, you'll get a sense of how smart those older guys were, right? They understood. I mean, this is actually a fairly sophisticated point, right? He's saying most people aren't going to be founders, but the fact that you could become a founder means you have stability in the factory, and our smart guys knew that they needed that. There's actually several trade-offs that are happening there. There's something else that he said also, and this is before the Bolshevik Revolution, right? This is before communism in the 20th century. Here's what he said. Any circumstance as the exhaustion of these lands would be a serious calamity, and the spirit of the trades unions international societies appear to be particularly mischievous and hateful because they seek to eliminate from the thoughts of their adherents the hope or expectation of independence. A member of a trades union is taught to regard himself and to act towards society as a hiring for life, and as hiring to remain such, and only demanding better conditions of their masters. If it were possible to infuse with this spirit all or the greater part of the non-capitalist class, this would, I believe, one of the greatest calamities we could befall us as a nation, because it degraded the master voters and made free government here very difficult, if it not entirely changed the form of our government and exposed us to lasting disorders and attacks upon property. That's literally what the Bolshevik Revolution was, right? Basically, the trades unions, right, essentially organized the non-capitalist class. Since there wasn't a frontier, they organized that into essentially changing the form of government to communism and exposing us to lasting disorders and attacks on property. So people, smart guys, saw this stuff coming 10, 20 years before the Bolshevik Revolution and before the century of communism. And they understood that reopening the frontier was actually the most fundamental way to fight communism, not simply by like shooting communists, but by actually giving a better opportunity for the working man. And it was the closing of that physical frontier that basically set the cage match of the 20th century. That's a good way of thinking about it, right? You know, the steel cage match, if you know what that is, steel cage match is like when this cage like descends and everybody's locked in and they just have to beat each other up, you know, to get out, right? So with the closing of the frontier, everybody was locked in and they all smashed each other's heads in the 20th century. That's what that was, right? Now, if we reopen the frontier, ambitious people can go and build outside as opposed to doing a zero-sum game and beating each other up in turn, right? So this is just another lens on why network state, why freedom cities, why startup societies. I'll close with one thing and let's welcome my friend Haseeb. So I'm going to be actually, probably, I kind of already am the #1 investor in quote freedom cities, startup societies, network states. but I will be doing even more stuff on this in the US, but also global, right? So this is something now where this is a piece of the future that is aligned with today, right? So 10 Freedom Cities, flying cars, right? This is a part of the program that is not within the administration, but outside, where the regulatory barriers to this will go down, right? So for those folks who are Americans and who want to build something or what have you, I'm very pro this about, this is, the thing is, sometimes I'll say things and people are like, oh my God, you're such a doomer. And other times they'll be, oh my God, you're so optimistic, right? But I'm a doomer optimist, all right? The doom of the old world and, the rise of the new, right? So anyway, I think we can ride the lightning, and this gives, again, these historical episodes give bits and pieces, subroutines that hopefully you can use to structure, the modern day and think about the future. All right, thanks guys, and let's welcome my friend Haseeb Qureshi. As Haseeb walks up, I will intro him. Haseeb is a GP at Dragonfly, and he's actually worked for me back in 2017.
Yes, I did, that's right.
And I got Haseeb, I think, started as an investor, and he's done phenomenally well, and we invested lots of stuff. He is, let's see, I don't know, he invests in a lot of different things. He invested in Polymarket with me and other things. And he will be a little bit more of the establishment defender than I will, right? He'll defend the establishment honor slightly more.
What defender?
The establishment.
The establishment, okay.
Slightly more.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, okay. We had a fun thing a year and a half ago at this very good conference that he had set up, where I debated my friend Nick Carter. And so the topic was, first I want to make sure this doesn't echo. Is it going to echo, Jackson? No? All right, okay.
All right.
Try. Good?
Think we're good? Yep.
Okay, good. So, I'll skip the small anecdote and leave to see. So, we had this, they set this really nice conference, and I was debating with my friend Nick Carter, and I was disarmed because I wasn't allowed to use slides. I wasn't allowed to give presentations, right? So they were asking me to do it with one hand behind my back, right? So I wrote the slides, put them in a short URL, and I spoke that short URL at the beginning, so people could look at my slides. Anyway, so go ahead, Steve, you want to introduce yourself to tell
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I'm Haseeb. I've known Balaji since, I think it was 2017 that we first met.
Yes.
When I was first making my way into crypto. I used to be, before I ever got into crypto, I used to be a professional poker player. Eventually found my way to Silicon Valley. I never studied anything technical in school. I learned through mostly an autodidact through the various things I've done in my life. So I was a software engineer working at Airbnb, found my way into the crypto world, worked with Balaji at 21, which became Run.com, which was Coinbase. I did not join Coinbase, started my own startup, and then eventually found my way to the investing side. First working with Naval at a fund called Metacivil Capital, and now I run one of the bigger funds in crypto called Dragonfly. So
that's right.
Yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
So, crypto's a big space, and people come into it from different points of view and so on. And I came into it from the libertarian radical point of view of the early 2010s, and I've moderated since then. And you've come into it from almost the gambler point of view or whatever from poker, like not then the educated gambler. Would you agree with that, or different points of view? I mean, now there's different lenses on this.
I would say I kind of came at it from multiple different angles. So I first heard about Bitcoin through gamblers. So back in 2011, actually there was a big online poker renaissance that really blew up in like the mid 2010 or mid aughts, and it got shut down in 2011 when the DOJ. Basically, there were a bunch of online poker sites that were doing a bunch of funny business with banks to like allow people to transfer money to these offshore poker sites and gamble. And it turns out this is super illegal. DOJ doesn't like that. So DOJ shut down a bunch of these sites. And that's around the time that I quit poker. And a bunch of my friends who were still professional gamblers, they started playing on these sites where they were settling their bets with a lot of international whales that they would play against using Bitcoin. And that was the first time that I heard about Bitcoin. But I thought of Bitcoin mostly as a way to like kind of pay shady people across the world. Like that was sort of my mental model. First time I bought Bitcoin was to buy Modafinil online in 2015. And then the first time I like bought Bitcoin was actually when Trump got elected in 2016.
Okay.
Because I thought Trump is going to destabilize the world, And how do you bet on the world getting destabilized? And my rudimentary understanding was that, I should probably buy Bitcoin.
It's
And-
funny. It's funny you say it because a similar thing with Obama, where so.
Of course,
Very much, right. But there's something you said that was very important, which is very interesting. A little side note, but also interesting. Like you may know this. You know the Satoshi client initially had a poker client in it.
It did, yeah, that's right. Never fully shipped.
Yeah. So Satoshi thought he had actually bundled an application with Bitcoin for poker playing. And if you go back to the very earliest builds, it had that because UIGEA, like this was the bill, right? Like they cracked down. The deplatforming, the unbanking of poker was a big thing in the late 2000s, and that was Operation Choke Point 1.0, if I'm not mistaken, right?
It was somewhat separate, but it was still under Obama.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So online gambling, and the other thing is you, like Armstrong, were at Airbnb.
That's right.
And you
We
learned...
worked on the same team that he worked on.
Oh, is that right?
Not while he was there, but
Okay.
I worked on his code.
So so that's funny because, I had thought, like a lot of people, that well, multinationals exist, therefore international payments must be solved.
Yeah.
And that was completely not true. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean that was kind of what crypto built me, because I would say before I started working at Airbnb, I had a very childlike understanding of how payments and finance works. It was just something I never really took that much interest in. But I worked on Airbnb, and the team I worked on basically did payments fraud. And payments at a company like Airbnb, pays people in 50 plus countries around the world. As a consumer, my perception of Airbnb is that, okay, you swipe a credit card, and then magically someone on the other side of the world gets paid, and that there's some digital system that just figures all this out. And what you learn when you actually go work on the system is that there is no digital system that figures all this out. There is a bunch of systems, all of which were built like 60 years ago, none of which talk to each other, none of which are 24/7, none of which speak in any common format. Some of them close on weekends, and some of them have different holidays, and some of them every midnight they email a CSV that has to be manually reconciled. There's all this just absolute garbage that you have to deal with when you're dealing with international payments. And as an engineer, when you see a system that's that broken, that's that ill-suited for the world that you're actually living in, which is 24/7, global, international, digital first, your first instinct is, we should throw this away, and we should do a rewrite. Right? We should start over, and not literally throw it away, but we should build a parallel system.
Yes.
And then as we see it start to work, we can start shifting over, right? And that's when it clicked for me that that's what crypto was.
Yes, that's right. And the thing about that is Airbnb in particular, if you think about it, we assume Airbnb exists, but it was actually a very difficult business to build because it was highly international from the beginning. You'd have Americans going to Turkey or English people going and visiting Japan because it's international travel. It's large amounts of money being transacted from people who don't know each other at all and actually often have low trust or disputes. That adds, all of those things added significant complexity.
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the closest thing that you could describe to a pseudo-state.
Yeah.
That is adjudicating these international disputes
Over
among
large
people
amounts of
who don't
money,
know each
under
other.
stress,
Exactly,
under time,
exactly.
yeah.
Which is also part of the reason why anti-fraud at a place like Airbnb was so difficult. And I think it's part of what contorted my brain in such a way that actually really worked well for crypto. Because when you work in anti-fraud, you're always thinking about, how can I break this?
Yeah.
If I'm just some random person in Eastern Europe or in China or whatever, and I want to fuck this system and make a bunch of money,
Yep.
what can I do to destroy it? And ironically, that's the environment that everything in crypto lives on.
It's funny because there's the saying the people used to say the internet's an untrusted network. They used to say that, and the contrast was to an intranet within your company, which was trusted, right?
Yeah.
And then people sort of lost sight of that when everybody, with social media, people put all their photos up and so on. You kind of just put everything out there. And now people are sort of coming back to, just because someone's on the internet doesn't mean they're a friend. They could be an attacker. And so you took that, and actually you also worked with Ebon, right?
That's
You
right.
did a bunch of security stuff. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. So actually, the very first thing that I did when I came into crypto, the first thing we ever did, there was a protocol at that time called Bancor, which was famous. It was famous at that time because, so this is like the ICO boom of 2017, 2018. And Bancor was, actually, how many people have heard of Bancor? Okay, so maybe 5, 6, 7 people. Okay, that's awesome. So Bancor, for those of you who don't know, Bancor, many of you probably heard of Uniswap. So Uniswap is, everyone thinks of it today as the first real big automated market maker, or AMM. But actually, there was a predecessor to Uniswap called Bancor. It was built by this Israeli team, and they became infamous in 2017 because they raised $130 million in their ICO in the span of like 30 minutes. And this was like the cover of Bloomberg. It was a huge story. It was like the moment that the ICO boom really penetrated the popular imagination.
Yeah.
They're like, holy shit, there's a lot of money flying around now, and something really fundamentally new is happening. And so anyway, me and Ivan, he was at Google Research at the time, we ended up discovering a front-running attack against Bancor. Today, it's called MEV. It's like a whole industry of you know, how you can basically use your ability to control blocks in order to make a bunch of money from people. But at the time, this was a really undiscovered concept. You know, and it was, I think everybody was a lot more naive about how blockchains worked at that time. But that was the first thing we ever did, and that really caused me to come into crypto with a security mindset and an adversarial mindset.
Right.
That all this stuff, you know, unlike with traditional internet services, you know, doing anti-fraud at Airbnb is a lot easier because you can just kind of look at an account and say, okay, this person kind of looks shady, let's just cut them off. You know, whereas in crypto, you can't do that, right? You can say, oh, well, this person looks to be North Korea, this person looks to be like some kind of bad actor, but guess what? You live in the state of nature relative to that person, right? If they find any bug in your smart contract, it's game over, right? Do not pass go, do not collect $200. So that causes a tremendous amount of like evolutionary selection pressure to be very, very, very secure relative to what you get in Web2 companies.
So this is actually a really, really critical point that I think the full scope of it, people don't understand this yet. You know, the Pentagon sucks at computer security. It's hacked over and like the US government sucks at computer security. Basically, there's the OPM hack, there's all these other hacks, and so you can look at them. Like all US government files, if you work for the US government, have been leaked on the internet. You know what's really awesome at computer security? We are. Our space is really awesome in computer security because we actually take it seriously. Like, you know, it's not just, okay, you know, we'll do some investigate. Like, if you get your keys compromised, you lose the money, right? So because of there's this site called rect.news. Do you know that, right?
Yeah, of course.
You want to describe it for them?
Yeah. So Rect is basically it's a website that's a compendium of every major crypto hack that's ever taken place and a postmortem of what exactly happened in that hack, how much money they lost, what the remediation was. And you go through that, and it's basically like it's essentially the obituaries of the crypto industry, right? These are the protocols that don't get to survive. They don't get to see the end of how it all turns out the way that we do. And this is actually very important because, you know, to Balaji's point, like the US government has gotten all sorts of leaks and hacks and all this sort of stuff. And it's just like, oh, well, too bad, you know, nobody gets fired, nobody, you know, nobody even is that inconvenienced seemingly by the fact that the US government just leaks like a sieve and it doesn't seem to be able to hold on to the most important things. You know, every single, what's it called, like the data brokers have all been attacked. Your passports have all been leaked multiple times over. Social security numbers, what was it, Equifax, and all these guys, just everything is now out there in the dark web, just, you know, freely traded to the point where your phone number, your social security number, like none of these things are actually secure. It's kind of a joke that we authenticate people with social security numbers when we know they've all been leaked multiple times over, and it's extremely cheap to buy these things. You can buy a compendium of millions and millions of Americans' personal information for like $100, you know, because it's just everywhere, so you know, nobody will pay much for it. So that compared to crypto, where you have protocols with billions of dollars that are at risk, and now of course there have been hacks in crypto that are massive, right? People who've lost tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. But the difference is that those people are not with us anymore. They did not get to join us in this beautiful journey that we're all on because they died. And that selection pressure turns out to be really important, right? It's the whole idea, the Schumpeterian idea of creative destruction.
Yes.
Which is that those who suck do not get to make it.
Exactly. And so this aspect of things, I think the next step for me, and the thing I think is really important, is we're going from crypto securing discords and DAOs, like communication and transactions, to doors and drones, right? To NFT door locks for the physical world. And then eventually, this is the control plane is on chain for the drones, right? Anything you really, 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 really care about, where a hack means you die, that's going to be secured by the same technology as crypto, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is one thing that people are, you know, as an investor, it's one thing I pay a lot of attention to now. as you start to see AIs and agents becoming more and more, starting to form, at least these sort of proto-agents we're starting to see actually being able to operate online and on-chain. One of the very obvious things is that if you are a non-human actor, you cannot get a bank account. Now, why can't you get a bank account? Well, the API for a bank account is that you have to be either a government, a corporation, or a person to have a bank account, right? We do not know, like our laws do not conform to the idea that this is not a person, a corporation, or a government. This is a drone. This is an AI. This is an AWS box. This is some kind of IoT device that has its own money. Now, we will be dealing with that world very fucking soon.
We already are.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of have these very, very small green shoots that we're starting to see arise, but within the span of 10 years, this stuff is going to be everywhere. And the reality is that our laws are not designed for anything like this, right? How do you do AML? How do you do KYC? How do you do sanctions? How do you do taxation, right? What does it even mean? We don't know. Do they pay social security taxes? They don't get any social security, obviously. They're not humans. So the reality is that the one thing we know about laws is that they're always way behind technology. But the thing about crypto is that crypto was already designed to be computer friendly, right? The API for crypto is such that it's really easy for an agent to custody a private key. And so before they are ever asking for permission or lobbying the government to say, hey, please allow us to open an account with JP Morgan, way before that, they're going to be using Bitcoin and stable coins and all sorts of stuff on chain before anybody ever even knows.
I have a thread from 2014 that I'll repost, which is Bitcoin is a bank account for AI. So from like 10, before AI or Bitcoin, so like 10 years ago. Right. And one of the reasons for this is when you think about the mechanics of it, it's not even, well, there is actually a precedent, and the rough precedent is IP addresses versus phone numbers or physical addresses. Like, it used to be that your address was something that you have to have like a human associated with, like a human address or a human phone number. And then with an IP address, a machine could send and receive calls to each other, right? And in a sense, people who know if you have a static IP address, people can place calls to you via VoIP or what have you. So that transition is sort of like the transition from a human-associated bank account to a machine bank account, right? Like a rough analogy in terms of that, but it wasn't as wrenching because it didn't impact. It was communication, not transaction, and transaction is taxation, and so on and so forth. So actually, are you seeing? I mean, my whole thesis, like AI makes everything fake, crypto makes it real again.
I've not heard this, but I think I get the gist.
Yeah, so it's like you get it from that, right? So AI is probabilistic, crypto is deterministic. Right. AI synthesizes, crypto verifies it, right? AI will, generate all these agents, and crypto is actually AI is abundance, crypto is scarcity. They're actually like complementary technologies in many ways, right? And really, crypto sets boundaries on what AIs can do. Crypto is what AIs work for, and so on and so forth, right? And like, something else I've thought about is, for the next generation of schooling, AI is currently going and making it possible to just have somebody answer all the questions on a test, right? So what I think is going to happen is the market is greater. Like, you have to do bounties, and then you pass them, and that's actually like your actual resume, because you can solve the problems easily, but just plug them into AI.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I was debating with a friend of mine earlier, is that, people worry about the wealth inequality that AI may encourage because of the fact that some people have, sort of the means of production, quote unquote, meaning like, okay, the open AIs of the world and so on. Then, of course, there is the concept of what if the AIs themselves are the ones that are actually generating all the money? Because at a certain point, like once AIs cross the level of capability or intelligence that the average human, which arguably maybe they already are, depending on how you measure, depends on the task, obviously. But for many of these things, one can imagine in not that long from now, you're going to get to the world where knowledge work, which right now is the highest compensated kind of work in our society, that AIs might just be better at it than the vast majority of humans. To the point where the humans are not really worried so much that, Sam Altman's making all the money, it's that the AIs are making all the money. And when the AIs are making all the money, okay, that's kind of a weird world, because AIs, what are they consuming besides more compute?
So like, what I think is the intermediate form on this, and this is also something that actually I wrote a thing on this sci-fi thing 10 years ago on this, is a self-driving car that drives around, self-driving Tesla, and it collects Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, and it uses that to pay for its gas or its charge or its parking, and then just keeps driving around and making you money, right? Like, that's not that different than a website that you'd set up like, you know, Peter Levels has all these websites that make him money while he sleeps, right? And it's like photos.ai or something like that. So the next version of that is you program this car, and it's smart enough, it's like a smart dog that can go and earn, go ahead, right? It's funny, right? So it's like a really smart dog. Go
Yeah, I
right?
mean, I think what ends up becoming weird is that a lot of our assumptions about economics kind of break when consumption and production become so untethered from each other.
So I think here's the fundamental question, and I have a somewhat, maybe not contrarian exactly, but what I'm not sure about is whether we actually get agentic intelligence as opposed to amplified intelligence. Do you know what I mean by this distinction?
Sure.
So like amplified intelligence is what AI is right now, where the smarter you are, the better you prompt AI, the better the result you get, right? Like you can just see a wide range, like the normie Midjourney versus expert, normie ChatGPT versus expert.
Right.
It's just increasing the, right? Whereas agentic is it's actually setting goals. And I actually have a theoretical argument for why I think agentic intelligence will be hard to achieve. You know why?
I think it's clearly demonstrably hard to achieve.
Yes, but I have a theoretical argument as to
Okay,
why
why?
I think it's paradigmatically difficult. At least we'll need a new breakthrough.
Okay.
And the reason is, I mentioned this before to some of you, time-varying domains. Right now, all AI training is based on a fundamentally time-invariant core. Example, the rules of chess are time-invariant. They don't change over time, right? The mapping between the characters DOG and an image or a 3D scan of a dog, that does, like the English language doesn't change that much over time. It's mostly time invariant, right? So all the things where you're lining up test and training data are essentially things where you're learning a time invariant mapping of some kind, right? Like from a chessboard to the next move, from an image to its label. But once you start going to the level of politics and markets, which are fundamentally time-varying adversarial domains, like the same input trade does not lead to the same output result, as we know. Like, you know, you've got people trying to, right? The same input political maneuver doesn't lead to the same output. And so the function of the entrepreneur is to sort of sense the market, sense the political environment, sense the media environment, and then give the instructions to the AI, which cannot do that.
This seems like too strong of a claim to me.
Go ahead, give me your
because you know, if you look at, so there's two kinds of learning that AI models do.
Yeah.
One kind of learning is literally training the model. So you just show it, like you mentioned, the sort of thousands of things that are mostly in the past. They're in a kind of a fixed data set that doesn't get updated very frequently, right?
Yep.
And you're absolutely right. The data set that it's going to be learning from is generally going to be stale. But and the other thing that we know is that it's very, very sample inefficient, meaning that for us humans to learn, we actually don't need that many examples in order to learn something. But it seems like AIs need like insane amounts of data in order to learn what to us seems like actually fairly straightforward to be able to learn. But that's only true when it comes to training a model. The other type of learning that models do is what's called in-context learning, right? Which is that when you shove something into the context window, like so let's say for example, you know, there's a famous experiment where somebody showed that they created a synthetic language and had some examples of the synthetic language, and the machine learning model was able to figure it out despite never having seen the synthetic language in its data set. Machine learning models do this kind of thing all the time, LLMs do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what we know is that actually when you put things in the context window, the sample efficiency of LLMs is much closer to what it is of humans. Meaning it doesn't need 5,000 examples in order to learn a pattern. Like you know this, you've used ChatGPT.
Mm-hmm.
You only need like, okay, here's an example, and then it instantly figures out what you want from it, right? And so when you see how the way a lot of these agents work is that you're putting the state of the world in the context window, and the LLM is able to very sample efficiently reason about the state of the world, as long as it's being pulled programmatically from an API, right? Now, what is your brain doing? Your brain is, you know, there's a central gateway that is your LLM, and it's taking in all these inputs from your eyes and from your ears and from your nose that produces this like global workspace of, hey, here's all the inputs, and synthesizing all these inputs, let's like come up with a plan based on your world model, even though your world model is stuck in the past.
Yeah, so it's funny because so 2 points on that, right?
Yeah.
The first is that when people talk about how it requires way more training for an AI to learn something than a human, my counter argument is that, you know, these brains of ours came over a billion years of evolution.
Sure.
So there's actually a lot of, in a sense, training or whatever that led up to it. So that might be, we're just having a different, you know, evolution process or whatever. It's just it's like a billion human years all at once, as opposed to,
Sure,
you know,
plausible.
right? Over time, right? That's one thought. The other thought, the context thing, but it's interesting. You know the concept of grokking in AI, right? Like grokking is when the AI learns a function as opposed to simply doing pattern detection. Like you showed enough examples of something, it actually, the function itself gets hard-coded. It reverse engineers the function and it stores that, and it gets it right every single time after that point. So, what you're describing, I have seen it. I guess here would be the test, right? The test would be, we actually have a humanoid robot that's taking in a feed through the eyes and ears, just like a human is, right? And maybe you also need the proprioceptors for the haptics or what have you. So taking in, because that's actually a very high bandwidth feed of video and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And then we see what that prompt results in.
So there is actually, if you look at robotics, so robotics has been one of these places that's felt a little bit left behind by all the stuff happening in language and vision, right? Which Transformers have been a huge explosion. And robotics is kind of like, well, the problem is like our data sets are just too small, right? They don't have like the big data that language does, because you can just feed all the internet into something. You can find every image on Google Image Search into something. But robotics data tends to be very specialized to a particular robot. And that's part of the frustration with robotics. Is like, well, we can't really use the same scale paradigm, because it's just really expensive to like generate all of this robotic arm data of like getting some teleoperator to like do a bunch of stuff. You just can't scale nearly as well as you can with language and these other things. But what we have seen is a lot of experimentation now with putting an LLM in the loop of robotics, right? And it's kind of janky. It wasn't really designed to do it, but what you see is that exactly, it's surprisingly helpful, right? Which is very much the kind of ghost in the shell architecture that we have. That it turns out, like, these LLMs, once they're fully trained, they're surprisingly general and sample efficient when they have the data in context.
It's funny because the extent to which an LLM actually has a world model, that is the big thing that people argue about. And it's funny, like the new CAPTCHAs, if you guys have seen this, push on that. They give logic problems. And I'm like actually looking, I mean, the IQ test of it, I'm like, you know what I'm talking about with the numerical things, whatever? It's like how many pairs are in this image or something like that. And it's really interesting to see the boundary of what the LLMs can't do. And it's often things that involve some rudimentary arithmetic or logic. And I have to assume that a good chunk of the people who are looking at them, that it's starting to get to an IQ level that is at least IQ 100 to log in or something like that, you know?
Yeah.
And it's getting harder, right? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think we're probably not that far away from getting captures of like count the number of R's in strawberry and things like this, like where we'll have to start getting things that really are just custom designed for LLMs.
Yes. They already are. They have to be already.
Yeah.
But then you'll get to crypto capture.
What do you imagine?
Meaning you have to log in with your ENS or SNS, which has a provably scarce. This is why AI makes everything fake, crypto makes it real again. So the CAPTCHA is there because how do I know if it's a real, human or it's a bot? But if you log in with your ENS or your SNS, you can have both a balance and a bunch of Web3 of trust proof of humans attached to your account, which means that, okay, that looks like a real human, right? This is actually, I think, I understand why Altman funded WorldCoin, because he's like, AI makes everything fake, crypto makes it real, right? Like basically his proof of human will restore humanity on the other side. I do think that this is actually going to be related to all the voter ID stuff that's going on, right? I think the huge push for voter ID at the same time as AI will mean that proof of human ceremonies, where you have a crypto ID associated with a voter ID, associated with I am human, that ceremony will be what citizenship becomes. Like, that kind of fuses like several different purposes into one thing.
Yeah, I think this is one place where probably you and I diverge. In that I don't think crypto and like web of trust type stuff is enough to create robust forms of identity.
It's necessary, it's not sufficient.
I would say that I think that for the foreseeable future, governments are still going to have a monopoly on provisioning identity, just because they're so specialized at it. They're so good at it, and they have such a strong incentive to do it for taxation reasons and for national security reasons.
Well, so it depends what government, right?
Sure.
So Singapore.
But I mean, look at India, right?
I know. So exactly, Eastern governments, right? Singapore, India, they have other, China, so it's sort of I agree with you, right? But that's because they are quote network states in a sense, where they have fused enough with the network, they have smart enough engineers on staff that they are not just giving you an easily falsified passport or something.
I don't think this is the reason why. I would say a simpler explanation for why India and China are able to provision these kind of digital first identity systems is just because they're younger governments.
That's what I'm saying.
Like, the US government is basically 250 years old.
Sure. So, but Estonia is also a good example. Started in 1991. They've got X-Road and so on. So, but that's my point.
It's like a young company, right? They start on Google Cloud instead of on
That's right. Because all these Eastern governments had to reboot after the fall of communism.
Right.
And so they got a fresh start, they got a civilizational reboot. But that's not true in the US and the
That's
West. In the West, ID is Google and it's Facebook and it's so on and so forth. That's like a less falsifiable, you know, we're not, actually let me give you a concrete example, right? There is an app that I have on my phone, which is called SingPass. And the thing about SingPass is, it's literally something, please don't take a photo of this, okay? But, so SingPass is like an app where, okay, it's got like your, you know, like license or whatever there, okay? And you can log into websites with this, right? This is your 2FA, okay?
Right.
Now, this exists here. This exists among the Estonia. This exists in India. This exists in China.
Yeah.
It does not exist in America.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
And it doesn't exist, to my knowledge, in much of Western Europe. Maybe it does, and, you know, I
Yeah.
can be told otherwise, right? So until something like that exists, I wouldn't agree that governments are good at ID. I would say
I
that
agree with you, but I think
some governments are good at it.
Yes, the way to understand this in my mind is that you look, for example, at credit cards, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in China, nobody uses credit cards. They basically skipped credit cards entirely because if you're coming online and starting to pay people in the 2000s, you might as well just go straight to QR code payments, right? Because they're just
Yes,
better
exactly.
in almost every way,
Leapfrog.
right? Yeah, they leapfrog, right?
Yes.
Exactly. So in the U.S., the reality is that we have this janky system of driver's licenses and passports and social security cards, which are all extremely low tech. There's no cryptography. They're just, like, trust me, bro. Here's a paper card, right? That's literally what your social security card is. And that the reality is that, like, well, in the low tech world, where basically, like, we're not the fraud rates are just so low that we can bear them. It's fine, right? It's not such an alarming problem that we have to deal with it. I think what you're about to see.
We're already there, I think. The high-tech world is all falsified.
Yeah, exactly. I think, like, basically the rise of LLMs and AIs is exactly the thing that's going to be the forcing function, that you're going to have to see a sort of national, like, Manhattan Project style mobilization of, shit, we need to completely rehaul our identity systems.
Mm-hmm.
And, all this stuff that was written in COBOL in the fucking 70s has to all be redone because of the fact that we are now getting effectively DDoSed by AIs.
Yeah.
And once that happens, the U.S. government has the capacity, especially with the military, to be able to mobilize for emergencies, but it's got to actually have an emergency. And so far, the reality is that, okay, it's kind of annoying to have Twitter comments every time you post something of, like, clearly written by LLMs. And now my, like, cold email spam is a little bit more annoying. It's personalized a little bit more for me, and it's like, okay, I can tell this wasn't a real person who wrote this. But it's not fever pitch yet.
Yeah.
And it will be.
Yeah, it's going to get fewer pitch, but the tricky part is this. I think we are in a small L libertarian moment in the West where the left libertarianism and right libertarianism will push back on national ID card type registration. We'll see, like, people will.
But isn't the
Right.
libertarian arm also arguing for voter ID and all this other stuff?
It's complicated. I think it's one of those things where we'll have to see what the implementation looks like, because maybe it's just completely flipped now and it's fine.
Right.
But for many years, the right was the one that was against, like, national ID cards and so on in the US, because they didn't want to be registered and tracked and surveilled for tax purposes. They wanted the fragmentation
Right.
and so on out there. And so often, like, the tribes have flipped so many times in the recent years. Like, the left used to be for free speech and for national ID card.
Yeah.
That is now flipped over, and it was for net neutrality.
Yeah.
Now the right has taken those, and the left is the opposite of those,
Yeah.
right? And you can see why that is, or whatever.
This is also why I like your framing
Yeah.
of reds versus blues as
Yes.
opposed to left versus right.
Exactly.
Because they are quite fluid.
They're fluid.
Clearly, they're not really committed to any particular ideology.
That's right. And so the thing is that I would expect that in the event that the national ID card kind of thing is tried to roll out, that blues will come into spoilers and say, it's COVID lockdown again, we're being tracked, we're being surveilled, do you want to give up your tax, and so on and so
The
forth.
reds will say this.
Some reds and some blues
Okay.
will try to thwart in this way, right? TLDR is something like Other, as you may know, and certainly the Chinese version, was quite difficult to get through in India and China, because any system like that in practice involves a bunch of non-ideologies, right? Like, oh, you've got, everything I'm doing is being tracked in a central database. Do I really want that, right? Do I really want some bureaucrat to be able to look up every single login I've ever done? There requires some trust in a central system for that to work.
Yeah.
And I question, I might be wrong, But it doesn't feel like that's the psychological moment in the West. I think instead you're going to get a bunch of decentralized crypto ID systems. That's why I think a decentralized West and a centralized East is my mental model for the world, where the network takes over functions in the West and the state manages those functions in the East. I may be wrong, but this is how I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's plausible. I tend to think that the state has such a strong interest in figuring this out once they start getting DDoS, right? Like the moment that your shit starts to not work,
Sure.
like taxation stops working, the state is going to wake up and it's going to figure out a way to solve this problem.
So here's a thought on taxation. Here's what I think the future of taxation is, just to talk about this. Well, just to be clear, this is a thought experiment and so on and so forth. Pay all taxes, file everything.
Important caveat.
Exactly. Remain in compliance with all laws, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. As a thought experiment, right? I think the future is the subscription state. Okay, let me explain what I mean by that. Dropbox, Google, these giant tech companies collect monies globally, like all kinds of SaaS products now collect money from dozens, sometimes more than 100 plus countries with credit card payments or crypto payments online without any police, without any tax collection whatsoever beyond simply shutting off the service if you don't pay, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if, I mean, I know for sure that Google, Amazon, Apple, etc. collect more in annual tax receipts than most countries out there, because most countries are small countries, right? So we actually already, and the thing about this is, the key thing is your account just gets shut off if you don't pay, right? That's non-violent, but it's also very firm, right? One of the things people talk about, soft power, hard power, you can actually say there's also digital soft power and digital hard power, right? Digital soft power is to convince, like you downrank somebody in a feed, but digital hard power is to coerce. You actually just ban them from the site 0 to 1.
So how would the state shut you off if you don't pay?
They shut off your sync pass, right? So that's now the transition to a digital ID system means,
If
because
you don't have a sync pass, that means you can't.
log into your bank account. This
You
all,
can't leave though.
well, then there'll have to be some physical layer. I'm not saying physical layer because, but many of your, when I say your sync pass, your X road in Estonia, your other equivalent, your social credit or whatever the Chinese ID version of that is, right? Like more and more the physical. Like think about, for example, remember during COVID, you had to go into a mall and you'd have to, at least here, there was like an app that you'd show to log into the mall, right? Like you'd have to show your COVID test results or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so something like that, I think, will come back where, but not in quite as oppressive a form. If you think about it, you've got digital lock for your Tesla, you've got an NFT door lock, you've got, you're constantly doing a double tap like this to pay for your food, at a restaurant with point of sale, right? And so on and so forth. All these things are just going to be digital unlocks, right? And then you have maybe two layers, where the first layer is your overall ability to be in the country, right? And the second is your specific, like for example, to get into a building in New York, you need a visa to be in the US. And you need, in a sense, a second visa to be inside the building, like, a card key to get up into your room, right? So you have a few, and you might have a third or whatever, okay, we get to that floor, but not into this specific room, something like that. So sort of layers of visas here, they're all digital. And if there's a beep beep where you can't log in, some level of the system is like, okay, that's an illegal alien, right? We're shutting off all their services. And it's kind of like, the Black Mirror thing where the guy is like blocked in the digital world from all these people. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There's a Black Mirror where, there's no violence that's sent to him. It's just that he can't communicate with anybody, he can't walk into any door, he can't log into any service, and so on and so forth. So this, while it sounds bleak, is way better than a guy with a gun coming and shooting you. It's also much more scalable than that, right? Like there's whatever 1,000 people that don't renew their Dropbox every day. Dropbox is a completely automated process.
So it sounds like you're then not supportive of Trump's desire to haul a bunch of illegal immigrants out of their homes and deport them.
It's a very complicated topic. So what do I think on this?
Yeah.
I think citizenship is membership, right? Like the set of friends is the set of citizens. That's what it should be. Like the entire concept of nation state was like, the term nation, the root word of that? It comes from the same term as natality, like common birth, right? So nation is like the people, and the state is like the government, and there's different as like labor and management in a factory, right? So like, for example, you had, right after 1945, you had the Japanese nation, the people, that was managed by the American state, because the Japanese weren't running their own government, the Americans were, right? So these are separable layers, and the whole concept, I'll get to this point in a second, the whole concept of the nation state was a group, a tribe, right? In order to say the nation is a tribe state. A tribe of people that consider themselves part of the same tribe, whether due to blood, whether due to language, whether due to culture, or due to religion, some combination thereof. Because it could be, for example, they could all be Christians or all be Muslims, but from different, races or whatever, right? So there's different variables and they all interact, and some tribes are defined in some ways and some in others. But this tribe gets to have form its own government, its self-government. That's a concept of the nation state, in theory. In practice, the question is, which tribe is considered a legitimate tribe to have territory? For example, the Kurds don't have territory, right? The Basques or the Catalonians in Spain, they don't have their own territory, right? And there's a guy who's the president of Kazakhstan who said something like, if every ethnic group that had a claim if every nation got their own state, there'd be like 500 nations in the world, because he had lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union, which we had just talked about, and all these nations got their own states, and it was just Grand Theft Auto and craziness. And he's like, go ahead.
No, please.
If we actually recognize that in practice, not in theory, it sounds good in theory, but what is a legitimate tribe to get land, and then what land do they get, right? Hard to know. So the problems arise when you don't have a nation state. Now, what is not a nation state? Because we say that term, right? For example, people will say China's a nation state, India's a nation state. It's not, right? Like, for example, India is a civilization state, more like the EU than anything else, right? It's like, the difference between Gujaratis and Bubbles is like the difference between Finns and Spaniards or something like that, right? That's like a civilization level thing, right? China's like a civilization level thing, EU is like a civilization level thing. Then you can have something which is not a nation state, but it is a multinational state, like Belgium, right? Which has like the French and, like these various other ethnic groups in Belgium, and they have like a power sharing like thing. Then you can have something which is a multinational empire, which is really what the US is, and what, let's remember what Britain was, right? Britain was self-declaredly a multinational empire, where there are many different administrative regions and so on. The point being that basically, what is a citizen is going to be the next question of like, what is money, right? Digital identity and digital passports are what comes after digital currency. And just like with digital currency, like it's actually a deep topic to ask, what is money? Is it, store of value, right? Medium exchange, unit of account. And there's a fourth one, which Andreas' thing on this? No. I really like this. The fourth part of money today, system of control. Right? So unit of account is like, what do you market something as dollars, right? Medium exchange, you pay. Store of value. And then system of control is, can people deplatform you, unbank you, freeze your account? That's a modern but fourth piece of it, right? Yeah. In the same way with like identity, I think we're going to have to rebuild identity from scratch. Should I give you my take on this? Or?
No. But I noticed you didn't actually answer the question.
Okay, but I think they're going to try it, right? I think that if you put a droplet of water, or if you put a droplet of something in, let's say you put a droplet of dye, like DYE, into water, and it like diffuses that. It was way easier to stop that from coming in than to have it in there, right? Sure. And so, what I think, there's definitely support for deporting like criminals and stuff like that.
Yeah.
The problem is,
you describe mass deportations, right? Like 20 million or something.
Well, here's all right. What do I think will happen versus what I think should happen, and so.
Yeah.
What I think will happen is I think that we're going to see a very serious inflation, and a lot of people will self-deport because there isn't economic opportunity. That's what I actually think is going to happen.
Yeah, it's true for the very poor. I think it's much more likely to affect people who have money than people who are wage earners.
Yeah, it's going to be really complicated, and there's going to be a lot of immigration and not simply immigration. That's one. There's basically like, I don't have a strong thesis on this, but let me describe like 5 different train cars that are all hitting the same point of what group of who's my set of friends, right? That's really the deep underlying point. Who are the group of people that I want to form a society, a town, a civilization, and so on with, right? First is, one of the big problems, I think a big blind spot that the US right has on this topic is they really like rotate on citizen status. Like, are you a US citizen or not? Except, for example, has anybody seen the image of Elon's guys at Twitter? Like the conference room, right? Okay, if you compare that to the group of people that was there, do you know what I'm talking about? No? It's this. It's basically, there's an image of Elon in a conference room after the successful Twitter takeover, and and then there's an image of it beforehand, right? And the thing about this is that basically the Twitter, you can find it if you do like Twitter before and after, okay? The people before were very well dressed, and they were, yeah, here we are. So, let's see if I can put this on screen somehow.
Oh, great, looks like they got thrown on screen.
Okay, let's see if we put this on screen.
Alrighty.
All right? Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, okay, so click this one over here. Yeah, Twitter before, can you zoom in on that?
Where have all the women gone?
Yeah, so of course they'll say where are the women, but here's the thing, there's several different dimensions to this. If you also, can you also look at new tab, NYT editorial board? Enter, yeah. Images. Okay, click that third image. Okay, so what's that? That is, you can right click and do open new tab. Or open. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so what is this? This is a group of well-dressed people in a conference room, and they're basically all US citizens, and they're on the left. Now, if we go back to Elon Twitter takeover, let's get a better image of that. This one, the first one. Click that. The first one. Yeah, the first image and open a new tab. You can do right clicking. Okay, that'll work also. All right, this is a group of poorly dressed people, okay, in a conference room that are mostly non-Americans, and these are the guys that restored free speech in the US, right? So, what the American right hasn't fully come to terms with is that the number one enemies of free speech are US citizens, and the way that they actually got free speech back was a group of global tech guys, including Elon and so on and so forth. It's like reinforcements that came in from the global internet, right? Most of these people are not US citizens, they're like immigrants or what have you, or at least often recent immigrants, right? SpaceX actually has to hire US citizens, Twitter didn't, right? So the poorly dressed non-citizens in the conference room are actually more libertarian right than the well-dressed US citizens, over here, right? That's like, I should probably do a thread on this, right? Where basically, for example, if you go back to that other image, this is not what people think of when they think of like the Republican Party. It's not Ole Miss, it's not the SEC, it's not, Southerners, nothing against Southerners or whatever, right? This is a completely different group of like global technologist reinforcements. And a deeper point is they don't actually have as much respect for the US government because they didn't grow up under the US government, many of them, right? So they don't care, like the New York Times cares and worships the state. These guys don't worship the state, they're people of the network, right? So it's like a third faction where there's the conservative, the past, the red tribe, the blue tribe, the present, and then the tech libertarian, like, the gray tribe, right? So that's why I think this is going to get complicated because a huge part of the new intellectual elite that's kind of working with the Republicans is demographically even less percentage-wise US citizens born in the US and so on than the conservatives. It's like the past and the future against the present, right? So that's, so anyway, we can turn this off, but basically, that's probably a good thread to put up. Go ahead, let me pause there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I see your point, and I can also tell that you have a natural affinity for immigrants, as do I. My parents were immigrants, and so there's a sense in which there's a vitality to immigrants that isn't necessarily there in native-born Americans. And
it's complicated. I don't want to diss native-born Americans because the thing is, immigrant is such a broad category. It includes like a gang member coming across the border. It includes Elon or what have you. It's like saying visitor or traveler or something like that. It's like not like a helpful category in some ways.
Sure.
But I guess my point is neither is citizen.
Sure. Okay. So
right?
actually,
that's
building
really,
on that point.
Yeah.
So earlier you claimed that you thought that states are going to move towards this kind of subscription system where instead of, okay, you're a citizen, tax you for life, you're kind of under our thumb, you decide when and how much you're willing to pay for our services, and whenever you want to exit, you can turn them off. What do we have?
I'm 2:53, so I'll go for a few more minutes and we'll
we'll wrap soon. I can tell people are getting
okay, sure.
So, okay, I think what you're describing doesn't really work under the way that governments are currently construed. For the same reason why, for example, you are not allowed to discharge student loan debt. Because there's an investment that all governments make in their citizens, which basically it's like, okay, we invest, you turn 18 to 19, 20, and we're just like pouring skills and energy and resources and love into you, ideally. And then as you get older, okay, now you start paying taxes, and it's actually worth, for your prime working years are when you pay it all back to society. And the shape of that curve is such that you cannot really treat it like Twitter or Google, where the cost to provide the service and the value you're receiving is uniform over time.
Yeah, well, so here's the thing. That is the same argument that East Germany and the Soviet Union and others have used to say, we own you when you're a kid, and we paid for your education, so you can't leave. You're betraying the great Soviet Union.
Right. So the U.S. lets you leave, you just have to pay a gigantic tax.
I know, but what I'm saying is that argument of, like, for example, India let people leave, but it's sometimes complained it's brain drain or so and so forth, right? So
here's what I claim is the alternative approach. As you said, look, if you look at, like, for example, UAE or Singapore, not everybody who's here is a citizen. Right? There are a lot of non-citizens who are residents. And I think that's probably what you need in order to have this kind of a system, is a two-tier...
So here's what I'd say. Well, the UAE and Singapore, yes, they do have a finish your sentence of a good.
Yeah. So basically there are people who are, okay, you're all in, you're not paying for the service, you are a member, But there's some people who are just renting the service. And if you're renting the service, well, you got to pay for school. If you want school, you pay for school. If you want other services that other people get for free, you are paying in, because I am not assuming that all of this is going to be this collective investment into you, because you can leave whatever the fuck you want.
Yeah.
So this kind of this lack of being able to recoup the investment you're making in human capital means that you have to price this thing differently, more like a software as a service type thing.
True, but I'll say a few things. One is, I do think Singapore and Dubai, we've studied them a fair bit in some of the tutorials and stuff like that. I do think they're actually maybe the two most important examples in the world right now, because they're attracting all the millionaires, are clearly very successful as societies despite not even existing 50 years ago. But they actually have a very fundamental, even though they're similar at 50,000 feet, which is they've got a CEO, right? They lay down the law, but they're also friendly to the rest of the world. They're like a good combination of, like, the police have not been abolished, right? The police exist, law and order, it's super clean, low crime. And you have people from all over the world, but they're actually very tough on immigration, overstayers, and so on. If you screw up in Dubai, you screw up in Singapore, you are absolutely booted. They are very, very intense, and even being over for a few days is like a big deal. Being a visa or share, you don't want to do that, right? So it's a common now. But what Singapore and Dubai have is different. So those respects are similar. They're also financial capitals, and so on. They have one huge difference. So maybe you're aware of this. Maybe this hasn't been on your radar, which is Dubai is, like, I believe, less than 10% Emirati. Right? And so it's like 90% non-Emiratis. And so, like, to be a citizen is to be at, like, the admin level, almost like a shareholder of the state, and everybody else is sort of working for it, but you're running admin. That works because actually they have some very smart people at that admin layer who have, or are landowners and so on and so forth. Singapore has the opposite approach, where they want to keep the Chinese majority, and then everybody else is a visitor. So I feel Singapore is actually, in a sense, doing it on easier mode than Dubai is. Dubai is managing it with a smaller percentage of people, a much larger percentage of foreigners, which is harder than Singapore. Singapore actually does a lot more nationalism, a lot more national service. Everybody who comes has to fully integrate, they have to be part of it, and so on and so forth. I understand how Singapore works. I think Dubai is working on an even higher level of difficulty.
I think a lot of that is just because of the fact that Singapore doesn't have natural resources. And that naturally changes the way...
Yeah, but UAE was not, like, oil is no longer a big part, percentage-wise, of the UAE. Like, it was something, it's not. It was a big part, it was startup capital, but it's like, I think it's like sub 20% or something like that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they're actually they're very well managed. It's actually a less well-known story than Singapore, and I feel I need to understand it more. You know what they do have? Oh, of course. They do have religion, right? Singapore has nationalism, the UAE has religion, right? So Islam does serve as kind of a glue there, that is a justification to keep folks, but you need something like that. You need either a nationalism or a religion to kind of glue the society together and say, here's what the majority believes, everybody else can be here, but you have to be visitors and respect the majority culture, right? Now, I think that the problem and I'll just say this and let's wrap and we can have questions for Haseeb. I think when I say citizenship is membership, what you're talking about is you're explaining why governments won't like their citizens leaving. I'm saying that that's a tension, like, is the citizen a slave, right? Like, is it that you grew up in a society and because there was some like tax spending or whatever, then you have to pay that out before you leave or whatever? This is a fundamental question of like, you know, are you the property of your society or whatever? You're renegotiating these questions from scratch, right? And what I think is going to happen is with cryptocurrency, for example, we've seen people basically opt out of their legacy currencies, right, into these cloud currencies, and now there's many people have more than 50% of their net worth in these cloud currencies. And I think the clear next step that's already ongoing is to opt out of their offline identities into their cloud identities, where their digital communities are primary and the offline is secondary. Already we have people who identify themselves primarily as Bitcoiners or Ethereans or whatever, but these cloud communities and the tension between those and the offline passports will be the next big thing. That's network state after cryptocurrency, in my view.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that's probably a good place to wrap.
all right, let's wrap. Okay, good. All right, guys. So let's wrap, and we can come and ask questions of Haseeb if you have any thoughts.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Good session. Thank you.